Hello and welcome to the NB Media Co-op. My name is David Gordon Koch, and I'm speaking today with Fredericton resident Angus Fletcher. Angus, thanks for joining us.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Angus, on Monday evening, July 31st, you attended a talk in New Maryland by Tanya Gaw of the group Action for Canada. I guess to start off, what motivated you to go and check out Tanya Gaw's talk?
So, especially recently, in and around Fredericton and Greater New Brunswick, we've been seeing a rise in anti-2S LGBT plus activism. We would see this in terms of folks counter-protesting drag events. Especially, there was one in Moncton in May. There were far-right counter-protesters at the 713 protest earlier last month. And to me, this indicates after specifically 7-1 after changes were made to 713, I think this signaled to people from the far right and more generally the far right across Canada that New Brunswick may be a fruitful place to sort of continue to push those agendas. I think that the changes in the rhetoric that were sort of adopted by the provincial government have encouraged folks to come out of the woodwork who might have stopped organizing prominently, as prominently after the lockdowns lifted. And we're seeing that those same groups that were very heavily involved in sort of convoy related activities and anti-vaccine related activities. All of those folks now are involved in a couple of other things, especially pretty heavily in sort of counter-Sharia or anti-Islamic rhetoric and anti-2S LGBT plus rhetoric. So I think that it's important to oppose these folks, both for electoral reasons, but also for grassroots reasons. They are showing up at events, and if they build critical mass, then I think that their harassment of queer folks and of immigrants could intensify, and I don't think that we should allow it.
And you also took in her talk, at least in part, correct?
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
And she is noted for espousing far right talking points. Just looking at an example from actionforcanada.com here, talking about critical race theory. And this website talks about, says it's a part of a dangerous and harmful Marxist agenda intended to destroy the foundation of our nation, which is built on Judeo-Christian principles. And Tanya Gaw and Action for Canada are also noted for anti-Islamic and anti-LGBTQ views. So could you talk about some of the themes in her talk?
Yeah, absolutely. So that presentation started with the For Verso Canada. So they took a very old version of O Canada and performed all of that. This is sort of part of a through line in those talks where they talk quite a bit about sort of the dominion of Canada being a Christian nation and their desire being to sort of return it to a nation under, they would not say Christian supremacy, but Christian supremacy is sort of the goal of the talk. So Tanya Gaw specifically spoke about initially becoming politically active when cannabis legalization started to happen, and spoke about the threat to 12-year-old children being able to buy cannabis. There's quite a bit of disinformation throughout this entire presentation. After which she spoke quite a bit on sort of counter Sharia and anti-immigrant talking points. So talking about how there's increased Muslim representation in the governance of Canada, which she doesn't agree with. She said, to paraphrase, she said something along the lines of, "It's okay for refugees to be here, but none of them should hold any kind of position of power unless they agree with our conception of a Canadian way of life." And then quite a bit of anti-LGBT or 2S LGBT plus rhetoric as well, sort of indicating her belief that that it's a mental illness, wanting sort of for folks to be closeted again, right? Like not wanting to really be exposed to people at all. Talked about Bill C-16, characterizing it as a bathroom bill, and also talked about the anti-Islamophobia bill as something that sort of promoted, promoted the ascendancy of Sharia law in Canada. Yeah, that would be the beginning and like a lot of the main talking points of the chat. Basically, like Canada being this Christian nation, this feeling that immigrants would threaten that, and also feeling that increased rights or visibility for 2S LGBT plus people would also be a step backwards for the country.
And you mentioned just before we started recording here that that you weren't there right up until the end. How did your experience end on Monday night?
A number of us were there as counter protesters. For the most part, we stood at the back and observed, and occasionally quipped or coughed loudly or whatnot. But as a presence to sort of demonstrate opposition and be a little bit annoying, I think would be like what we could sort of describe. Our goal is at that point there weren't very many of us, and the room was fairly packed, so we were sort of limited to standing at the back. One of our number, once they started sort of talking about this conception of Canada as a Christian nation, one of our numbers stood up and started and shouted a little bit about sort of the indigenous nature of the land, that element of the history, and then started to walk out. That person was then accosted by 5 or 6 members of the group, and eventually left, after which the group called the RCMP to report that. So I remained with the rest of folks to wait to see how that would go, and then left shortly after. It was fairly clear I probably wasn't going to get back in afterwards.
So as you say, Angus, there's been a mobilization on the far right, but there's also been a mobilization of people opposing the far right in New Brunswick. And with Monday's event, there was a number of complaints. There were a number of complaints sent to the Village of New Maryland before the event took place, and before you attended with protesters. The village later put out a statement on its website and on social media, acknowledging concerns about the event, actually listing several of the statements found on the Action for Canada website. Also saying that the Village of New Maryland is reviewing its rental policy to avoid this kind of thing happening in the future. Your reaction to New Maryland's response to this?
Yeah, so there were some, I think, fairly strange parts of that response. One would be, there was originally, it was later redacted, but or removed, but there was originally the response also included that that counselors from the Village of New Maryland would attend the talk, and they invited other people in the community to do so as well if they had issues or critiques about the talk, which is I'm not certain what the sort of desired outcome of something like that is. It seemed like they were, I think they were likely scrambling to do something in the absence of the ability to, or the perceived absence of the ability to actually cancel the talk at that point. My understanding is that it would probably have been fairly late for them to cancel it, but I can't speak for the Village of New Maryland. I think that they said anything publicly at all is encouraging. They could simply have said nothing and instead chose to recognize that this is that this is an error, um, and speak about that. I think it would have been good for them to take the opportunity to speak with local 2S LGBTQ T plus organizations about this particular issue, because I think those groups would probably have had good advice about how to proceed as well. Um, so my hope is that that moving forward they do take that advice, especially when reviewing their policies. It seems as though they were caught flat-footed about this particular issue, and I think that there are some fairly simple changes that could be made to the rental policy that would help with this, including, perhaps asking for sample promotional material or a
Hmm.
summary of the nature of the actual event. My understanding is that they likely didn't understand the nature of the event until it was pointed out to them by community members.
What about free speech? When we look at the coverage of this event, the CBC quotes the law professor Carrie Frock,
Mhm.
who is quoted as saying, uh, there's a lot of speech that we allow that people would find obnoxious, offensive, abusive, or mentally distressing, but we have to have a large free reign for expression because of the ills that censorship might cause. Uh, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I showed up because there is a framework for speech that already exists here in Canada around hate speech, and uh, I think that those laws, like laws around hate speech and speech that is a that calls people to act on violence, especially against marginalized populations. I think that those protections are a net good, but I don't I don't disagree with free speech. I just think that in cases like this, I think that direct opposition to speech like this um, should be a part of the reaction to it. I think that in some cases, when what they're doing is not hate speech, they're, I think, technically entitled to share their opinions, but they're not entitled to share their opinions in an uncontested space, nor are they entitled to share their opinions in a community that thinks that those opinions are noxious, right? Um, that opposition to that kind of speech is just as important. And so for me personally, it's, I'm not opposing speech primarily. I am more interested in frustrating organization, because the more these groups organize and the more they amass power, in my experience, especially recently, the people who espouse views like these um, uh, do not really like a fair fight. When they show up to an event and they don't have numbers, they often leave after they have about 45 minutes, or after 45 minutes or so. But in situations where they can grow those numbers, I think that they will be more emboldened. And I think that historically, that has not gone well for marginalized populations.
Looking at the CBC article, it suggests that or the professor cited there suggests that restrictions on who is allowed to speak in a municipal hall might not hold up in court. But it sounds like what you're saying is that even if that's the case, then people pushing a far right agenda in New Brunswick shouldn't expect that their presence will go uncontested. That they should expect an organized opposition to show up and to challenge them in person. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that, like, this is true regardless of venue, right? That, like, some of these folks have spoken in legions before, and many people who older folks who have served in the military do not condone the views of like far right views or possibly fascist related views, right? I think that in any situation, if these folks speak, it's appropriate to call the venue and ask if the message that's happening there aligns with the values of that venue. And I think that that's an appropriate pressure tactic, regardless of the venue. The venue doesn't have to listen.
And a moment ago, you mentioned that, when these large groups, or when a group of any significance in size, with a far right or neo-fascist tendency gets together, it doesn't tend to go well for minorities. I'm just wondering if you could elaborate on that point, because I think it gets to the crux of why someone like you would take time out of their Monday night to show up at an event like this.
Yeah. So when like if we look at something here like Policy 713, there are sort of two prongs of kind of what would be happening to SLGBTQ folks right now. On the one prong is an administrative or bureaucratic prong, and that is a change made at the state level that does direct harm to folks in these populations, right? Like I think we'd have spoken about it quite a bit, but that is a time where folks have a much higher risk of suicide and self harm as a result of not being able to express themselves, either to not be closeted, right? And that administrative violence is real and has a strong and heavy effect on these populations. But it also signals, historically, a lot of these groups have done a lot of their work also through street violence, or through street assembly. And you can see this in like a lot of places in the last 100 years. You can see it in Germany and Italy. In England, there was a fairly heavy fascist movement. There was quite a large fascist movement in Canada. One of the most one of the biggest sort of pro versus or one of the biggest fascist riots in Canadian history would have been the Christie Pitts riot in Toronto, which would have been large fascist groups that decided to try to do violence to minorities and folks who fought back. These are people who fairly openly talk about how they want more numbers to be able to do their organizing, and I would prefer not to find out what they would do with them.
Angus Fletcher, Fredericton resident, thanks for speaking to us today. Anything else to add before you go?
I know that when you see some of the views that are presented by folks like these, that sometimes they can seem silly and worthy of discount due to the sort of heavily conspiratorial nature of these views. But I think that they are serious, and that the people who hold them are serious, and that they intend to act on those views.
Good note to end it on. Thanks for taking the time to speak to the MB Media Co-op.
Thanks.